day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be with you here today, talking to you via a medium that many had barely heard of 18 months ago. In the days when Zooming was something you did with your handheld camera to focus on an event far away. I'm no Zoomologist, but if you think back to the period at the end of 2019 and what our lives were like at that time and the things that we took for granted, such as going to a restaurant with our friends or colleagues, attending a live concert, shopping at a store, or even taking your children to school. Not only did we shop and live differently, we also commuted to work. Some of us often traveled abroad on business trips, had family holidays, and even visited friends in their homes. In short, we had choices. We socialized and interacted with many people. Our lives were active, varied, and very often outside of our homes. In December 2019, there were some vague reports in the media about a virus in China. Little did we know the depth of that change and what was about to befall us. Globalization's Achilles heel, as well as its unparalleled advantage, was its connectivity. People around the globe traveled and met face to face. That allowed a virus to travel with us at great speed, and that has ultimately changed our lives, probably forever. So what has changed? Well, we, for one, spend far more time working in our homes with our families and our children, some struggling with homeschooling, or at least that's what many of us do. When we go shopping, we often head for a computer screen, not the shopping mall. And I guess that's one of the keys here. We live far more in the virtual world, which is still, in many ways, has an even greater impact on the physical world of the global supply chain. When the pandemic hit in the West in early 2020, there was an initial decline in goods being shipped as lockdowns kicked in and people were told to stay at home. Ships were traveling to Europe and the US 90% empty. Carriers cut vessels from rotations in a bid to cut costs as fear set in that the carriers were facing a revenue catastrophe. Neither the manufacturers in Asia, the ports, or the lines were prepared for this COVID demand bounce, which saw volumes rebound in the second half of the year to levels that exceeded the pre-pandemic maximums. This spike in demand caused supply chains to quickly choke up as vessels and equipment were in the wrong places. Spot rates began to soar, and as a consequence, the lack of space on ships, which had earlier been empty, meant shippers were competing for capacity. Carriers were foregoing the export cargoes, which commanded far lower freight rates, in order to return empty containers to Asia in an effort to maximize profits. Gene Soroka, the executive director at one of America's most important ports in Los Angeles, pointed out that part of the decline in the US exports has been the basic understanding that imports move to major metropolitan areas where consumers live. But exports, whether they're agricultural, manufacturing, or automotive, and their tiered suppliers, are typically domiciled in rural America. So how to square that circle is the real question here, and technology has got to drive that decision-making on a broader basis. The Federal Maritime Commission is still investigating the failure by the lines to handle export cargo, which has declined by 5.7% in Q1 this year, while empty repositioning has increased some 14%. That led to accusations from shippers that lines were rushing empties back to Asia to take advantage of stratospheric rates and refusing to carry export cargo. That accusation remains unclear under the investigation by the FMC and is expected to report soon on the issues in the US in the meantime. Meanwhile, Europe's spot rates spiked at levels in excess of $8,000. With container equipment sucked into the peaking Pacific trade, Asian ports lacked equipment to export to other regions, causing a spike in rates for cargo along the trade route, including the subcontinent and the Middle East. So when the Evergreen ran aground in the Suez in late March, the congestion levels were already high. But the accident in the Suez has caused more than just a ripple in the supply chains. Visibility of such events has become 2020, with connectivity of the supply chain already at all-time high levels. One of the side effects of that level of visibility is that people who rarely considered where their clothes, furniture, or food came from instantly became experts on logistics. Do you know these ships come from China? They're 400 meters long, can you believe it? And it's taken me 3 months to deliver my sofa. So everyone suddenly became aware of the fragility of global supply chains and how connected we all are globally. News of the Suez blockage became global within hours of the event. Photos of the vessel straddling the waterway on social media and satellite images were readily available. We knew where our cargo was because we could literally see it on the news. However, the Ever Given event revealed two things to the general public and to industry professionals. A, how reliant we are on supply chains, and B, how susceptible those supply chains are to disruptions and changes in purchasing behavior. In a sense, Ever Given was a wake-up call because it only prevented the movement of 83 billion worth of goods for 6 days when it could have been for months. Moreover, we found that we did not know whether our goods had been delayed for certain, what condition our cargo was in, and what condition it would be in when it arrived at its destination. So the fragility of these supply chains was exposed, not only at the obvious bottleneck in the Suez Canal, but also the consequences of the event rippled out over time and the region, hitting supply chains in the Pacific as well as in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and in parts of Africa. Globalization was not just about the positive effect of global connectivity, but it also had a negative effects on a similar scale when inevitable accidents happen. Supply chain disruption from the pandemic is now taking a 1-2 punch by the disruption in the Suez. So one of the more enduring elements of these disruptions has been the addition of detention and demurrage charges, D&D as we know them. These D&D charges have multiplied as delays at ports and inland terminals mean the dwell times for containers have increased substantially. It remains unclear how much has been charged to U.S. cargo owners as the FMC does not collect this information. FMC Commissioner Carl Benzel said recently that congestion and prolonged dwell times has led to complaints by BCOs that D&D charges are being levied unfairly. But as Benzel pointed out in a recent webinar sponsored by project44, D&D charges are penalties and fines designed to keep equipment moving, so that BCOs do not keep containers for longer than necessary, and for containers to ship empties out of ports. According to Benzel, and I quote, "The general principle to evaluate whether D&D charges are fair is to look at whether or not they are intended to create fluidity in the movement of cargo, or whether importers and exporters and truckers are being penalized based on conditions that are outside of their control." So, using this as a guiding principle should protect the public from unreasonable charges, including D&D penalties, according to Benzel. The focus from the FMC in looking at the application of the D&D charges is on the transportation in terms of its availability, billing practices, empty returns of containers, and any issues related to the intermodal supply chain in the US. In its investigation into D&D charges, the FMC is focusing on how D&Ds are applied. Whether transportation was available for containers when D&Ds were levied, billing practices, empty returns of containers, and issues in the intermodal supply chain. Complex issues around D&D charges in the US mean that the understanding of how these charges are levied remain unclear to shippers, particularly as the ports and inland terminals in the US are clearly suffering from major delays. At the height of the congestion, more than 40 ships were at anchor awaiting a berth outside the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Those delays were up to double the time to deliver cargo from booking to delivery, between 8 and 9 weeks. Similar delays can be seen in European ports and terminals, with mounting congestions having become a severe problem. Critically, these interruptions to the flow of cargo can be dealt with more easily if cargo owners are aware of the bottlenecks and growing levels of data are providing this information. The challenge for data and information suppliers is to offer this information ahead of the shipper's booking so that the customer can decide to send their cargo through the quickest and most efficient route before booking. Notwithstanding any black swan events, of course. Digital technology is shining a light in what was the gloomy realm of supply chain visibility. Data on visibility is an investment that can cut costs for shippers, offer better outcomes, provide alternative means in the planning of routes for cargo delivery. Visibility and market data in this sense are profound and necessary. And now that the genie of the digital age has been summoned from the bottle, there will be no putting it back in the bottle.
Good day, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Thanks, Josh, for this insightful introduction. I too am not a student of zoomology, but we know from the statistics that digitalization has taken a massive leap forward on both the consumer side of the logistics chain, the so-called B2C element, and the operational end of the logistics chain, the upstream B2B element end of the supply chain. That increases visibility in the supply chain, and today I will look at the evolution of consumer experiences, particularly in the consumer societies of North America and Europe, as well as some of the changes in service delivery and digitalization takes hold. We will trace rise of digital consumerism and involving science of data analysis that is helping to drive changes. And working our way back the supply chain, we will look at how those that deliver the cargo are adapting to meet the challenges. Manufacturing centers in Asia deliver the goods to consumer in the West, but digitalization has arguably narrowed by depth of field the distance between the manufacturer and the consumer. In the US and Europe, online shopping has increased by up to 30% by some estimations. According to America's National Retail Federation, online sales increases 22.1% year on year in January. And this year, we were 11% higher than the month before. It seems we no longer spend money on service industries like cinemas, dining out, and travel is definitely out of the question. So, far more money is being spent on home office equipment, furniture, and clothes. The NRF expect year-on-year sales in the US have increased by 25% this year. Western economies and some in Asia have been popped up by governments handing out cash to citizens. And much of that cash is spent online, of course. That online presence is track and traceable. We will leave a trail of our habits in the virtual world in a way that we never did pre-pandemic. We were getting there. I'm aware that online sales were rising, tracking the usage of credit card has becoming more sophisticated, but COVID-19 has accelerated this process up to 10 years, according to some, and that has altered the way we trade. Further back along the supply chain, Amazon taught us that what we did online was worth knowing about, and that data remains king. Away from customers and retailers, we are looking at manufacturing centers and long supply chains from Asia into Europe and North America. Those supply chains have changed as the Amazon effect has taken over, shipping goods directly to customers rather than retailers and intermediates. That connection is growing and the algorithm become more sophisticated. Walmart is developing micro-fulfillment centers, a dozen of its stores, while Target had smashing year and positioned to benefit from the expected mall closures in the coming years. Target, over years, unknowingly prepared for this pandemic, having put a lot of investment into its supply chain and fulfillment infrastructure. Target's holiday comparable sales were 17.2% up and digital sales were up 102%. In America, the mall, the place where shoppers spend their money, is changing fast. Where American leads, it's probable that Europe will follow. In effect, retail as we knew it pre-pandemic is being swept aside as our behaviors adapt to a new normal. We are demanding to know when our cargo will arrive. But this is now a requirement that is down to consumer level. We order an item. We want to know where it is along the various points of the journey, of course. That's true of consumers as well as shippers and consignees. Visibility in supply chain is being demanded every step of the way. European consumers are little different to their counterparts in the US. As one of the senior bankers explained, US consumers spend all their money, very little is safe. That means with the driving season missed, holidays abroad cancelled, and events such as theater, cinemas, gym and restaurants closed, US consumers have an estimated 1 trillion ready to go, which could drive in a surge in North America throughout this year. European consumers are far more conservative, but by contrast, and are more likely to save cash rather than spend. Nevertheless, a surge in demand in Europe has been seen. For shippers, the quality of information is crucial because it can mean the difference between having a plan to make alternative arrangement or not. In one recent scenario, a consignment of pharmaceuticals was delayed on board ship. The delay was quickly relayed to the shipper, and the consignment of critical medical supplies were sent by air. Without the visibility in the supply chain, the recovery would not have been able to happen in this instance. That visibility is getting more granular, particularly for high-value cargo such as fish and other foodstuff. Connectivity in the Internet of Things means that condition monitoring is becoming an essential tool. That is monitoring temperature, humidity, and other levels within the container, as well as time spent on board of the truck, ship, train, at ports, and whether the container has been opened. We've heard from Josh earlier, lockdowns in the majority of manufacturing economies as a result of the spread of COVID-19 virus expired changes in the way we live. First by the strangulation of the trade in the manufacturing sector, and later the consuming countries, which then lead to a massive surge in consumerism, particularly in the US, but also in Europe. Those surges demands caused by a breakdown on the flow of containers, with dwell times in consumer regions, again primarily in the US, doubling containers were not returning fast enough to Asia to meet the growing surge in demand. This is the turn pushed spot rate into a stratospheric rise as shippers fought for the empty containers and the space on ships. Both remain at premium today. With Carl Benzel, the Federal Maritime Commissioner, telling a project44 audience that he expected rates to remain high in perpetuity. Costs of the consumers are likely to increase, but cargo travels, such as high quantities over the sea leg of its journey, that the cost will be shared between many thousands of consumers. However, the inland leg of the journey, and particularly the last mile, could become more costly yet, as decarbonization will add further cost to the logistics. Shifts the behavior of consumers are being driven by technology change. And that data is available on online retail outlets. Market has become target, essentially offering a personalized service to consumers. Further changes are expected with the relationships between consumers and retailers. Those modalities are forcing changes further upstream in the supply chain as service suppliers look to control not only the assets that physically supply goods, but also with a direct downstream relationship with customers. It's a recipe for transition as shipping lines seems to build their advantages. For example, CMA CGM recently launched an air freight service, and it's rapidly expanding these offers. The same French carrier is developing its freight forwarding services. The world's largest, probably most innovative carrier, Maersk, has worked for a number of years now to develop its digital systems. Both customer-facing and international operation system includes its joint development of the trade lanes logistics platform in partnership with IBM and its blockchain technology. More recent, another world's mega shipping line, MSC, launched its own electronic bill of lading through the WaveBL, a technology company which with offices in the US and Israel, which already includes Israeli carrier Zim and the Danish mega freight forwarder DSV, which recently acquired by the 3PL Agility GIL with a $4 billion deal. The logistics landscape is changing fast, and it's moving towards a greater visibility, bringing connection between manufacturers and consumers closer and focusing on the ability of those operating in the supply chain to meet their obligations. A senior Maersk executive recently admitted that the reliability of the maritime sector has degraded sharply to unacceptably low levels. In the past, supply chains were opaque, making it difficult to understand where the bottlenecks were. Today, through the information sharing technologies, we can see where the delays are, often what it cost them, and on average, how long the delays will be. It's only a matter of hours before pictures of this blocked Suez Canal at the end of March reached social media. Supply chain visibility is a technology advantage of the clarity of sight will only become one way. It will come into sharper focus in the future. Thanks.